Hey everyone, it is good to be with you. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm excited this morning because I'm starting a new series. And I'm excited about this series because I'm also anxious about it. It's a little strange sounding, but I've hit this place in where I am right now with this COVID reality. 8 months into this, 50 days, I've kind of hit a wall. And so I'm anxious about this series because, to be honest, I'm moving into territory unfamiliar to me. I'm taking some risks in a lot of this. And we'll be doing more interviews. I'll be having some fun with others and trying to explore some of these ideas. But I want to look at the Sermon on the Mount, the discourse that Jesus gives in 3 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew, 5 through 7. And in particular, I want to explore that in the context of where we find ourselves right now, in this place of unknowing, in this place of brokenness, this place of divisiveness, this place of contention, in this place of sorrow and ambivalence and numbness, really. I've hit this wall personally that I've been trying for the last 8 months, exploring, improvising, adapting. We've all been doing this in our different ways. Some of you learning new jobs, some of you learning how to be out of a job and adapting to that. We've all been in these challenging realities, if only the reality of the way of life has been is gone in so many ways. And so what will the future look like? 8 months from now, if and when vaccinations are distributed and available and effective, will the future be the same? I don't think we'll be back to normal. We'll have something new, but what would that be? What's the next step in this mystery? Is such a challenge for me right now. I've hit this wall. And so I'm going to explore with you where we are in all of this tension, and with the election just around the corner, and all of the divisiveness there, and the tension, the anxiety. I'm entitling this sermon, Don't Be a Jerk, a primer to the kingdom of heaven. And there's a reason for using that phrase, but a friend of mine said, really, you're going to use that phrase? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, that seems a little negative. Don't you think your folks are going to find that offensive? I said, not my folks. I don't think so. She said, well, what about the fact that it feels kind of like a clickbait, like you're just trying to sort of trick them, shock them with something negative, And I said, well, no, I'm not trying to do that. She said, well, they're not going to, they're going to see that and maybe not even stick with it until you get to something positive. I said, no, my people are pretty used to me flying around in the air for the longest time before I ever land the plane. And sometimes I don't even land it, but they still stick with me. They're curious, mostly curious like I'm curious. And which is why I say I hope you'll continue to take some risks in this series as I'm taking some risks. I said, no, that's not what I'm worried about. She said, well, what are you worried about? I said, when I say don't be a jerk, I'm worried that they're going to think they know who I'm talking about. Linda said I could have gone with something else like, be the change you want to see. John Wesley's exhortation, do all the good you can, to all the places you can, in all the ways you can. All of these things are good, sure. Do good. Be the change you want to see. We've been doing these kinds of things. Certainly, a lot of us in our different work field, places of work, and even in our volunteerism, there's been a lot of that going on. We are trying to be helpful in all the ways we can be with one another and with others. But still, there's something underneath all of that, right? There's something that we're not looking at that's being invited here, but I feel like we haven't really explored it. And I've hit this wall, and I'm trying to figure out what it's trying to tell me, if that makes sense to you. So I want to look at this text, the Sermon on the Mount, Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. And I want to explore for what it is maybe saying about where we are. Jesus finishes it up with this idea. He finishes up chapter 7 with this exhortation, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. This is the law summed up, the law and the prophets. And he said, and that golden rule is prominent and prevalent in almost all the religions around the world. And still that do unto others as you would have them do unto you, it hints at this idea, don't be a jerk. But there's something else that's bigger than all of that. So what I want you to think about in this idea of don't be a jerk is not the who. We're going to go there. We're going to look at it. We're going to see don't be a jerk. Immediately we're going to think of somebody, someone that we know or that we think about, and maybe even ourselves at times. But I want us to think not of the who, but of the what. And that's a bit cryptic, but it'll make more sense as we go through this. What I'm talking about here is not the who of being a jerk, but the what. Matthew's gospel, for example. When Matthew presents Jesus, he presents Jesus in a certain way by the time of chapter 5. Jesus has gone through the birth narratives, gone out into Egypt with his family, trying to escape Herod's a mass murder. He goes to John the Baptist to be baptized. He goes up in the mountain to experience the temptations. When he comes down to Galilee in chapter 4, he hasn't really done anything in terms of all the signs and miracles. Instead, Matthew has confirmed for his listening audience, his specific community, this is who Jesus is, this lineage that he has. But now he goes into Galilee and he's got people following him, just all of a sudden, large crowds. He's picked up a few disciples. He ends up outside the city and he's up in the mountain and he's about to do something. And chapter 5 begins then with the words, "And Jesus opened his mouth and began to teach." Now there's something about the way in which Jesus is teacher that speaks to Matthew and resonates to what the kingdom of God is all about. So let's look at teaching and learning. I want to explore these two words. You know how I love to kind of play with words, the etymologies of words, and look at their roots. And it's curious because the root meaning of learn and teach have the same shared root understanding. If you look at the Proto-Indo-European root of teach, it means to reveal, to uncover, so to speak. And if you look at the root to learn, almost the same root word, a little bit of a different meaning. It means to follow, to track, as if in a trail or a scent. It means to follow or track. It literally means the sole of one's foot, the bottom of one's foot. It literally means the sole of one's foot. It's like this idea that you learn by the walking. So teaching and learning is this process of something opening up, something being revealed, and following that path, exploring it to wherever it goes, to discover its meaning. We don't think of teaching that way. We don't think of learning that way today. I mean, our understanding of teaching is more factorized, is more industrialized. It's more of the sort of this process of dissemination and acquisition. We give you information, you learn the information, you regurgitate the information, you do it well enough, you move on to the next level. And the acquisition of this information is to give you skills, perhaps, to acquire a certain training, or perhaps to move on to a certain degree, but much less of this idea of we just introduce you to possibilities that hopefully will inspire you to explore. I mean, that's kind of the essence of what Jesus is doing here, because he's not teaching in terms of giving you something you already know. Teaching and learning is about creating a path of curiosity and potential discovery by having things uncovered that you didn't expect, by suddenly realizing there's something you thought you knew that you didn't know. There's nothing to teach or to learn in the process of teaching something to someone they already know, right? There's nothing really to teach or learn in the process of teaching something they're completely comfortable with. I mean, we enjoy familiarity, we enjoy being comfortable. In fact, that's why we associate with people who think like us, why our tribes typically are people that think like us, that we can resonate with what they say and they can resonate with what we say, and we can all feel affirmed and feel comforted in where we are with reality. And that's important. It feels safe, and that's not a bad thing. But it's not necessarily about learning, right? It's not really this idea of seeing the bigger picture, which is so challenging for us in our time, in this binary reality, in this contentious reality, in this reality of where the jerks know who the jerks are, or we know who they are. Instead, what Jesus is doing is he's doing this thing of flipping what's known on its ear, of teaching by way of question and paradox. So what I want to get across right at the beginning as we think about this idea of don't be a jerk, this primer for the kingdom of heaven and where we find it, how we participate in it. What I want to get across is this idea that transformation can't take place without some process of unknowing, without some process of unmasking. Until what you think you know You suddenly realize something new is being offered and it's worth pursuing, even if you don't know necessarily where it's going to go. I mean, where have you experienced a teaching in your life, a teacher, a person, maybe not a teacher, maybe it was an adult, maybe it was a friend, a parent. Where have you experienced this moment where what you thought you knew was suddenly broken open? And in the process of seeing that being broken open, you began to pursue it. You walked, you followed that path into a process of change. Just be nice doesn't seem to address that. Not that just being nice is not a good thing, of course, but don't be a jerk, I think, gets a little bit more at the idea of the what, not the who. We know what, if I say don't be a jerk, we know who are the jerks, right? We've been cut off on the highway. We've seen someone speed down our neighborhood streets carelessly. We've been around people who smoke and blow their smoke in our direction, their secondhand smoke, without a second thought. We've been around people who don't wear their masks in public, at the restaurant or in a crowded grocery store. We've been in places where people talk so loud no one else can talk, or we can't hear our own conversation 2 tables away. We've been in these work settings where our fellow workers, we've been dismissed by a particular worker or a particular fellow staff person, or we've been discounted in the context of our workplace. We know what it's like to feel bullied. And we know what it's like to feel like calling someone a jerk as a consequence. And we may not say it out loud, but we may feel it, right? We feel that sense of tension, increased heart rate, discomfort. So what I want to suggest to you is that's part of one of the definitions of what jerk is this involuntary motion, right? This involuntary quick motion that's accompanied by fear, but we often experience it around unlikable, mean people or being treated in an unlikable, disrespectful way. And yet the idea is, if we were just looking at don't be a jerk as an admonition, that's not what we're talking about, because it doesn't really work. Does it? Don't be a jerk. Okay, makes sense. I won't. That doesn't really happen. My aunt was a jerk. Now, it's a hard thing to say. I know it's a hard thing to hear someone say. Linda knew my Aunt Jane, and everybody in the family knew it too. As kids, we loved her. She was sarcastic. She was funny. We often saw the way in which she kind of criticized people or insulted others. We often saw that as kind of humorous as kids, because we loved her laugh, and we loved her fiery red hair, and we loved her huge, big, broad teeth smile. And so we put up with kind of the sarcasm and the insult and the anger and sort of the aggressiveness that she sometimes felt with others, and even the sort of insulting that she often made towards particular people. We kind of put up with it. As we got older, we really began to learn better and to know better. And yet we missed that part of her that was fun to be around, that jovial, infectious laugh. As she got older, though, she also began to isolate herself increasingly because of this sarcastic way of being in relationship with others, because of this judgmental way of being with others. And so she really was kind of a jerk, and she was hard to be around. She got remarried in her 70s, a retired military colonel. They moved to Pampa, Texas. And we didn't see her much, but we heard from people who visited her, and she joined a church there, a Presbyterian church. And the fact is she'd become active in groups there for a while until the groups decided to stop nominating her for these positions because she would be exceedingly critical and increasingly judgmental and even insulting to other members. She just, as she was older, she wasn't happy. And it continued to be evident, increasingly evident. Some years after they moved to Pampa, I was up in Minnesota, and I met this person up there at this festival I was performing at. She was a fellow performer. She was from Pampa, Texas, this young woman. She was singer-songwriter. I said, "You're from Pampa?" She said, "Yeah." I said, that's amazing. I said, "I don't know anybody from Pampa except that I have an aunt who lives there." She says, "You have an aunt in Pampa?" It's a small town. I mean, there's maybe 10,000 people, and I know a lot of people, so maybe I know her. I said, "You would not know my aunt. I mean, if you wouldn't want to know her. She's mean, she's critical, she's just kind of a spiteful person. I mean, kind of a jerk. And the woman looked at me and she said, "Your aunt is Jane Davis?" Yeah. I mean, I loved her. And we all did. But we also knew how hard it was, increasingly, to be around her. As a child, it was funny. As an adult, it was difficult. And you couldn't really change it. No, you couldn't really teach her out of that. Not in a direct way. Don't be a jerk. No. When she got ill and moved back to Fort Worth after her second husband had died, she developed severe kidney disease. And so she was in the hospital once, and I went to visit her. It was probably a year before she died. She was in her 90s. And I didn't know where she was. I knew she was on the third floor in that unit. And I didn't know the room, but I found the hallway because I looked down the hallway and I noticed there was a group of about 3 or 4 nurses that were kind of arguing and fighting with one another. And they seemed to be debating about something. And as I got closer, they were literally saying, "Listen, I gave her the medicine last time. Somebody else needs to do it this time." And I walked up and I said, "Are you all talking about Jane Davis?" And they said, "Yeah, do you know her? You relative?" I said, "I'm her nephew." They said, "Great." And they grabbed me by the shoulder and one of them walked in with the medicine. But that didn't help. She just took the pill, threw it on the floor and tossed the cup at the nurse and cussed at her. And the nurse was magnanimous and heroic about it. She smiled, she laughed. She said, "Well, Miss Davis, you're going to have to take your medicine. Maybe your nephew can help you." And she looked at me and she said, "No, hell, he's just a preacher come to pray for my soul." And I kind of laughed and said, "That's not why I came." And after a while, she calmed down enough that we could talk a little bit, but she continued to complain about the nursing staff, about the place where just about the conditions of the hospital, and one thing after another. It was just complaining and anger. And then she'd look at me and she'd kind of give me this sarcastic look, roll her eyes and say, "You probably need to pray for my soul." And I'd just kind of laugh. And after a while, she stopped talking. I reminded her how much I enjoyed being with her as a kid and how much I was thankful. If I had a prayer, I'd say I was thankful about her laughter and about her infectious spirit of fun. And not so much her critical spirit, I say, but really how I remember her in terms of our explorations in the creek behind her house and the fun that we'd have back there. And she smiled for a little bit and kind of calmed down, as if maybe she'd forgotten that part of her. And then she eventually fell asleep for just a few moments. And when she opened up her eyes, I was there, and she looked at me. She said, "Hell, you still here? Don't you know a watched pot never boils?" I laughed. Well, she died about a year later. And knowing her has reminded me over the years of this thing that Ross Gay wrote about in his book that has moved me ever since reading it. He wrote in his Book of Delights, in his book called Book of Delights, he wrote about a student named Bethany, one of his students in his writing class. He said Bethany was going to be a teacher, and she had a particular pedagogical orientation that she wanted to develop with her own college students once she got to be a teacher. She said it was going to be about recognizing first and foremost that we all have a shared wilderness. That these wildernesses, that our lives represent these wildernesses, these mysteries, this wild that we don't know. It can be dangerous, it can be scary, it can be fun, and it can be amazing, delightful in the discoveries that we would have. She said this wilderness is what we have together. And that got Ross Gay thinking about this idea of what our wilderness represents, that each of us, all of us have this wilderness. That it might be we're up against a wall. It might be that we're dealing with a sorrow or a loss. But all of us, he said, every one of us, he said, by which I mean everything and everyone lives with some sense of sorrow, and at some time a profound sense. Whether it's a brother who's addicted, a mother murdered, or dad who died in surgery, someone rejected by their family, or the cancer has come back, or they've been evicted. Everyone, regardless, everywhere, always, everything. He said, not to mention the existential sorrow that we all are afflicted with, that we will soon lose something, a loved one, a way of being, or our own mortality. He said, maybe sorrow is the true wild. Maybe when you recognize your wild and I'm recognizing mine, and then we begin to recognize we each have this wild, that when we recognize that and join that wild together, then maybe we have begun to invite something more delightful. When I think about what Jesus says, he doesn't say just be nice. He doesn't start off his Beatitudes that way. He says, blessed, fortunate are you. You're loved by God, those of you who are broken in spirit, impoverished, poor. Those of you who are facing numbing hardships, because yours is the kingdom of heaven. In this broken space, in this place, this poverty of spirit, as Howard Thurman says, that inward sea that we have to sometimes find and get to before we can find that authentic self, that brokenness is the entrance to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says, blessed are you who mourn and are brokenhearted. Amy Jill Levine says in her book, The Kingdom of Heaven, the Sermon on the Mount, she says that this idea of mourning and being broken is not simply about the loss of someone. It's not simply grief. It's that for sure. But she says it's a greater understanding of the loss that we experience in community. Because she said all of these are not about individuals. None of these blessings, as Jesus sees all of these teachings, they're about they're communitarian. They're about the community. Like the song of Solomon Burke that the band sang that was so amazing. This none of us are free if one of us is chained. This inextricable interconnectedness, like Martin Luther King would speak about. We are all interconnected, intertwined in this destiny of life. When we begin to recognize that, we begin to mourn. We begin to experience this wider sense of what's out of place, what's out of balance. Blessed are those who then mourn, Jesus says, because theirs is, they will be delight. They will experience delight. They will experience consolation. Blessed are the meek, Jesus says, favored by God, essentially. Not those with power, not those with success and prosperity, but the meek, those with power and privilege and comfort who set aside all of this in order to be present to others who have so much less, in order to honor them, in order to honor the marginalized, in order to see and to hear and to feel, for they shall inherit the earth, the very ground of our being, for they are the substance of the beloved community. It's this idea, right? This idea of meekness that A.J. Levine says is not simply because you're born in a state of simplicity, you don't have much meekness, she said, depends on you having had privilege, having power, having some sense of prosperity that you set aside, that and it's not even, you simply don't value it so much that you cannot be present to anyone, anywhere, at any time who may have less, who may be marginalized, who may be ostracized, who may be ignored, unseen. Blessed are those who intentionally set that aside, set their power aside to be present to others. Jesus reminds his Jewish listeners, and by extensions all of us today, that our guiding myth that we've accepted here in the West, this idea of rugged individualism or omniscience of the all-powerful empire that was present in Rome, all of that is turned on its ear, because what is true for the kingdom of heaven is that we are all strangers in the land and we are co-stewards of this path to life. Those who have easily fall prey to this idea of prosperity, what we've called the prosperity gospel, that the reason why we're prosperous is because God has blessed us. And so from time to time, we take a moment to be charitable to those with less. And yet, that orientation continues to other those people. It continues to see them as something other than us, which isn't what the kingdom is all about at all. Don't be a jerk has as much to do with what as it has to do with who. The bigger picture is we are all part of this inextricable reality. Jesus has turned the myth of this prosperous gospel of the importance of success on its ear, saying that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who are hungry. Blessed are the meek, and those who mourn. So the Beatitudes, which is what Jesus teaches first in this Sermon on the Mount, are about flipping the status quo and about reminding us that this imbalance and the very cracking at the fabric of humanity is the place that opens up where we find the indwelling kingdom, the kingdom of God, the place where we begin to see what we didn't know. The other day I was traveling through Missouri. I want to finish up with a couple of thoughts. As I was traveling through Missouri, and I'd make these occasional stops and rest areas and travel stations, and I met this guy who was not wearing a mask as he came in. And I don't think I told you about this, but as he came into the restroom, I was about to leave. He came in with his grandsons, about 3 of them, and none of them were wearing masks. And so I just stood there with my mask on. He was standing in the door with the door open without his, and he looked at me and then scowled. And I didn't say anything, but he said, "Look, I'm not going to put on a mask just because you think I need to." And I kind of shook my head, and it stunned me. I kind of just went through the door real quick. I didn't know what to say. I didn't feel like getting in an argument. But the further I got away from the door, the more I began to say to myself, "What a jerk. What an idiot. I couldn't believe he'd be that rude. I can't believe how uncaring he is." And it began to spill out of, well, it spilled in my mind. I wasn't saying it out loud. But in the car, it just was tense, right? That sudden motion, that sudden, sense of discomfort and heart racing. And everywhere I went throughout several of the states, the truck stops and such, and I'd walk in with my mask on, certainly ran into a lot of folks that would just look at me like I was doing something wrong, and they would scowl. They weren't wearing masks, and they roll their eyes. Occasionally would say something, mutter under their breath. Well, as I continued to drive and made my way up towards Chicago, I couldn't help but be struck by something that was happening all around me, and that was the change of the seasons, right? The beautiful colors, the oranges, the reds, the yellows, the oak trees, the maples, the red maples, the birch woods, all these amazing, beautiful colors were changing. And I began thinking to myself, as I was watching this change, I was thinking, change has never looked more beautiful. And it occurred to me, in essence, death and decay was looking so amazing as it began to drop off its outer layers. It began to unmask and to shed its outer layers. And I kid you not, as I was driving west to east, south of Chicago, toward Gary, Indiana, a Sufjan Stevens song came on called Chicago. I'm south of Chicago, and here's the song called Chicago comes on. And the lyrics, it's a beautiful song, you should check it out. The lyrics echoed in my mind as I continued to drive. The chorus goes like this: "You come to change us, all things go, and rearrange us in our mind and in our time. You came to take us, all things go, and recreate us, all things grow in our time." There's this joy to be found in the path of God's kingdom at the heart of brokenness, the poverty of spirit and meekness, where there's this opportunity for unknowing. And even there and then, this idea of it's not about who is a jerk. It's really about the bigger picture. What is happening? And where are these opportunities for us to begin to find this shared sorrow, this shared discomfort, this wilderness, and then beyond that, possibility for delight, the end breaking of God's kingdom.